Hi everyone, happy Wednesday. Some reminders for the course. So homework 1 is due tonight. Maybe there are a little bit fewer people today because maybe people are working on it right now. Maybe we should have made it due before the lecture. I guess homework 2 isn't quite out yet, but it will be out tonight. Also, we would love for you to fill out the project survey by today as well. Again, this is non-binding. We're mostly using it to assign mentors, and it's helpful if you submit it. If you don't submit it by today, then we will give you a mentor after you submit your proposal. Also, tomorrow we have a tutorial on variational inference. This will be super useful if you want to understand parts of the lecture on Monday. It's not required. The lecture on Monday, I think it's pretty useful for getting some intuition behind the ideas in multitask learning and meta-learning and what task structure really means. But if you aren't interested in kind of diving deeper into that, then it's also fine to skip that. The tutorial will be recorded and made available on Canvas. Yeah. It'll be on Zoom, yeah. Yeah, if people have strong preferences for in-person things, we can try to do that for the last tutorial, but there's like a huge room shortage on campus, and so the registrar hasn't been giving us rooms when we ask for them. Cool. So the question for today is, how should we define tasks if we want good meta-learning performance? And we'll be looking at 2 different aspects of this problem. We'll briefly recap meta-learning approaches and task construction. This will give you a chance to also ask any questions that you have from the content from the past 3 lectures. Then we'll talk about the memorization problem in meta-learning, potential solutions for it, and scenarios where we can do meta-learning without any tasks being provided. One disclaimer is that a lot of the topics that we'll cover today are really at the edge of research, and so I encourage you to ask questions. But also, sometimes the answer to those questions will be that it's an open question that the field hasn't figured out yet. The goals by the end of the lecture are to understand what this memorization problem is, when and how it occurs. This is super important if you're going to do a project on meta-learning, because you might inadvertently set things up in a way that causes this problem. And it'll also help you understand techniques for constructing tasks automatically. Great. So to recap, we talked about 3 different meta-learning approaches. One is a black box approach that parameterizes this learner as a neural network. This is very expressive, but it also leads to a challenging optimization problem. We also saw optimization-based approaches where you embed an optimization into the learning process and you optimize for this optimizer to do well with small amounts of data. This builds in the structure of the optimization into the meta-learning process, which is quite helpful. It also requires a second-order optimization. In the lecture on Monday this week, we also covered non-parametric meta-learning. And the way that this works is we compute an embedding of the examples in the training data and the examples for our query example. And then we essentially do some form of nearest neighbors in order to, and then a dot product with the labels in order to make a prediction. And so really the key idea here is to have some sort of non-parametric learner. And you want to do this in the context of some sort of parametric embedding function or distance function. And so this could be k-nearest neighbors to examples or k-nearest neighbors to prototypes. This is pretty easy to optimize, and it's also computationally pretty fast because you can just get the answer through a forward pass through this computation graph. It's also largely restricted to classification, and so if you have problems with continuous labels, this isn't as applicable. We've also talked about constructing task distributions, and one of the kind of canonical examples that we've looked at throughout is using labeled images from previous classes in order to construct these image classification problems, where each task corresponded to a different n-way k-shot classification problem. And then we also looked at a couple examples briefly of other ways that we could form tasks. For example, we could have tasks correspond to different regions of the world where you want to quickly adapt to a new region, or tasks could correspond to different objects and you want to be able to generalize to new objects from, say, a single demonstration. Great. Any questions on this kind of review content? Okay. Great. So now let's talk about memorization. And before we get into that, I'm going to give you a thought exercise. And this won't actually relate to task construction quite yet. And in particular, say you have a black box meta-learner that takes as input the support set, or the training set for task I, and then uses that to make predictions for new examples. And now let's say that you also have a task identifier, like a one-hot ID for each of the tasks. What if you also pass this identifier into the network in addition to passing in the data? Does anyone have thoughts on what would happen during meta training time if you did this? Yeah?
And wouldn't it then be easier just to memorize like a mapping from the task identifier to the actual test instead of the mapping from the images?
Yeah, so essentially what it can do is now it can just learn a mapping from the task identifier to the test image to the label and ignore the training data. And in particular, if the network finds it difficult to learn from the data, it can just ignore it and purely rely on ZI. Yeah?
And for the homework, that would go similar if you didn't shuffle it, right? Because then it would just memorize in order with the images.
Yeah, you're like 2 steps ahead.
Okay.
We'll get to there in a couple slides. Now, what happens if you pass in, what happens at meta test time now? You now have a one-hot identifier for a new task. What will happen? Yeah?
Because the coordinate doesn't say the new identifier before, so it will generalize terribly.
Yeah, so it'll perform really terribly because the one-hot identifier is a new one-hot, it's like a new integer that it's never seen before, and it won't really generalize at all to the new task because it doesn't know what it's supposed to be doing. Cool, so this is a problem. Now, second thought exercise. Now, instead of having a one-hot vector, we have like a natural language description in the form of a paragraph that describes what the network is supposed to do. Does anyone have thoughts what will happen in this case? Will it be the same as the previous scenario? Will it be different? Yeah?
Still, it would be better than in the previous case because it's not like all of the descriptions are actually like independent of the actual task. But it's still based on some the description dependency.
Yeah, so you're saying that it might still kind of depend purely on the description. It may not be quite as bad as before. Yeah?
And it would depend if all the ZIs are independent, I think. Because if all of the descriptions were different, what would be the difference in one hot? Like, it's just a unique identifier still. So I think you have the same problem, just if that description may have an overlap, like if they're very similar or the same for 2 tasks, then it would be different. But in the other case, I'd say it's the same.
Yeah, so that's a great point. If the paragraphs are like completely unique, then it's essentially just a unique identifier for the tasks, and you might have something similar come up. Yeah?
Maybe it would help your test time because you can, like, I don't know, parse that prompt and compare it to previous prompts you've seen. If I do this new task better.
Yeah, so you may actually do better at meta test time for the new task because you're not just given a new one-hot like integer, you're at least given a description, and if it can actually generalize from that description, then it should actually be able to solve the task. Cool. So in particular, a paragraph description may be more complex to kind of infer the task from. If they're completely unique from one another, it's going to be pretty simple. But if there's only like one character that's different in that paragraph, it might be difficult for it to interpret that description. And so what the network ends up using will probably depend on which is simpler. Like if it's simpler to learn from the data than to interpret the paragraph text, it will probably use the data. If it's simpler to use the paragraph description, then it will probably use that description. And this also will kind of, the results of meta testing will also depend on this. And if it can actually, if it does actually start to interpret the text, that it will actually generalize to the test task. Yeah?
Maybe is the problem here that we want the models that algorithm to recognize that tasks are written without explicitly telling it that tasks are written?
So you're asking, like, is the problem here that essentially the network isn't...
Like just passing in the identifier rather than just the data set. Are we trying to, but I guess are we, because we still want the network to be differentiate between tasks, but by giving this learning the easy way out, so is that the kind of conflict?
Yeah, exactly. So there are different ways to solve the task, and it could potentially kind of take the easy way out by just like looking at an identifier or looking at something that differentiates in the descriptions. And kind of the crux of it is that it can essentially kind of minimize the meta-training loss. It can do well at all the training tasks without looking at the training data at all in both of these scenarios. And that means that at test time, if you want it to actually improve using the data, it won't actually be able to do that because it learned to completely ignore the data during meta-training. Cool. So this is a pretty important concept in meta-learning. And the reason is that now when you go about constructing tasks, you need to keep in mind whether or not you can actually interpret, whether it will actually learn from the data or whether it will use some other signal to determine what the task is. And so in particular, one of the things that you saw in the homework is that we, for example, had kind of set up these tasks where we had different tasks corresponding to different sets of images. And we assigned a label to each of the tasks. And we explicitly randomized the assignment of labels to images. And so if you look at these in like task 1, the bird class is assigned a label of 0, whereas in task 3, the bird class is assigned a label of 1. And this means that you can't actually solve the task without looking at the training data for each task. And because we're randomly assigning class labels to image classes, this means that tasks are what I would call mutually exclusive, in the sense that you can't solve all of the tasks with a single model. And so as a result, they have to use the data in order to infer the label ordering, and they have to use the data to learn the problem or to learn the task. Cool. So now what if the label assignment is consistent across tasks? And what I mean by that is, what if you always assign the bird class a label of 0, you always assign the dog class a label of 2, the landscape a label of 1, and so forth. Do people have thoughts on what will happen here? Yeah? Yeah, so you don't have to look at the data at all, and you don't even actually have to look at any sort of index either. You can essentially classify the examples in each of these blue boxes with completely ignoring the data, essentially. And so the tasks are what I would call non-mutually exclusive. A single function can solve all of the tasks and learn a classifier that classifies all the examples in the blue boxes without looking at the green boxes. And essentially, the network can simply learn to classify inputs irrespective of the training set. Yeah?
In this case, the model will be looking at the training labels, or what would be the function using to classify?
Yeah, great question. So it's not actually going to be looking at anything in the green boxes. It's going to be looking at the images in the blue box, the image that's provided at meta test time, and then it's going to predict the label from that. And it doesn't need any task identifier because it can just look at the image and predict the label, because the labels are all consistent across all the tasks. Yeah?
So basically, it will become a classification problem?
Yeah, it'll just become a vanilla classification problem. Yeah?
So with the consistency across both the support and the training set.
Yeah, so it's important that the labels are consistent across all the tasks and also across the support and query sets. Yeah.
And would the same thing happen if I always take like 0 and 1, and So we don't have consistency across the task, but like 0 and 1, I'm always taking the first images, and my test is always the first images too. It just learns the mapping of 0, 1.
Yeah, so if you don't shuffle the order of images that you pass into the network in the test sets, in the query sets, if you don't shuffle those, then it will always just memorize that the first thing that you give it is a label of 0, the second thing you give it is a label of 1, and so forth. And in that scenario, you also don't have to look at the training data. Yeah?
So alternatively, we have shuffle the training and then
so if you shuffle the training data and keep the query set in order, you still have that same problem because it can still remember that the first query image is a 0, the second query image is a 1, and so forth. Yeah?
But in that case, like if there are different classes across like the different tasks, then there could still be some sort of memorization of mapping the like indices to the like the query in the order. But if the support set is like shuffled for the query set, not you would still have to get something from the database to make sure it knows which of those like orders we use, right?
So if your test examples, if your query set always like passes in order where the first example is 0, second example is 1, and so forth, and you have a recurrent network, then it can just essentially learn how to count. And in that case, it actually doesn't even have to look at the images in the query set. Not only does it not have to look at the data, it can just not look at the images at all and just learn how to count and say, like, this image is a 0, this image is a 1, and so forth. Whereas in some approaches, if you don't have a recurrent network and it's just a feed-forward model, then whether or not you shuffle the query set is less important. Yeah?
Why don't we just randomize both?
Yeah, so yeah, if you randomize the ordering that you pass in the images and you also randomize the labels, you'll of course want to make the labels consistent between support and query, but if you randomize everything else, then you won't run into this issue. And so, in particular, if you have this consistent ordering across all the tasks, then it can ignore the training data set. This is true for a black box approach where it will just learn this classifier. This is actually also true for optimization-based approaches as well, where it can essentially learn a network for which the gradient update doesn't really actually affect anything, and it will still memorize and still learn a classifier that ignores the training data. Cool. And so the other thing that's a problem is if the label ordering is consistent and it learns to ignore the training data, then if you give it examples of new training classes and a support set of those training classes, then it's not going to know what the correct label is for these images, and it won't be able to solve this test task because it's ignoring the data. And so if you actually evaluate MAML with this meta-train, meta-test setup, you get kind of a performance of around 7% for 20-way one-shot and around 50% for 20-way five-shot. And this is a lot worse than if you actually shuffle the meaning of the labels across the tasks. Yeah?
Just one quick check. So if, instead of the line that would be a dog, it would classify the dog as a 2 instead of 1, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if the lion was a dog instead of a lion, then it would output a 2. And that would be the correct thing. This is a problem when you have new classes. Cool. Now you might wonder, is this actually a problem? In image classification, we could just shuffle the labels. We know how to solve this. Maybe all is still okay. And it's also not a problem if you see the same image classes as you saw during training. So if we only saw like dogs and stuff like that, then it's just a classification problem and all is also fine. But it does become a problem if you want to be able to adapt with data for new tasks and you're not in image classification settings where somehow the task identifier is easy to interpret from something in the data that you're passing in. And so as another example, say you wanted a robot to be able to learn different tasks. And you also want to give it a natural language description of the problem, like closing the drawer, picking up the hammer, stacking the blocks. And we want to give it those instructions so that it can actually quickly do those tasks and get a sense for what you're actually asking it to do. But then if you give it a test task where you want it to learn how to close a box, it hasn't seen the close box instruction before, but you are allowing it to learn from data. If you try to do meta training on these tasks and then have it learn this new task, the robot is going to ignore the trials that you give it, the training data that you give it for each task. And not only will it not be able to generalize to this task, but it also won't be able to quickly learn it because during meta training, it just ignored all of the training data. As another example, say we want to predict the pose of objects, or sorry, the orientation of objects. And we have different objects in our meta training data set, all with like a kind of a consistent canonical orientation of each particular object. Then if you give it a new object, which has a new canonical orientation, in this scenario, it can essentially memorize the canonical orientation of all the training objects, and it won't generalize to the new object from data because it learned to memorize the canonical orientation rather than actually inferring the orientation from data. Cool. So this is another scenario where the model wouldn't actually be able to learn how to predict the orientation of a new object. Okay, so now that we've gone over the problem of memorization, is there something that we can do about it? Yeah?
What exactly is memorization? Everything is shuffled, right?
Yeah, so essentially when it sees a couch, it will know, if the couch was in its training data, it will know, it can kind of essentially memorize, like, I guess to predict the orientation of an object, you need some reference point, which is what I'm referring to as the canonical orientation. And when it sees a couch, it will know that the canonical orientation is like maybe facing the camera or something. And then it can just directly predict the orientation relative to the canonical orientation it memorized. And it can do that for all of the objects. It might be able to guess what the canonical orientation is for a new object if it's something that is kind of sensible. But in many cases, there isn't like there isn't any sort of like universal canonical orientation for objects that is that necessarily that you can like infer from the object shape. And as a result, it's memorizing this canonical orientation in a way that allows it to just ignore the support set for each of the tasks, and then when it's given a new support set, it won't actually be able to learn from that support set.
But how are they getting that reference point? Like, they answer, like, for example, the meta-training task for the couch, like, the couch is just, like, randomly rotated, so how does it know that there is one specific canonical reference that it should memorize?
Yeah, so the labels will essentially tell you, so from the image, you need to predict the orientation relative to the canonical orientation. The labels will tell you, essentially, from multiple labels of an object, you can infer what the canonical orientation is through the training process. Okay, so can we actually do something about this problem? There is actually, I'll present one solution that we can do for it. I don't think that there's really any like amazing solution for it, but I'll present one thing that seems to work somewhat well. And yeah, if anyone has any other ideas, we can also discuss that. So if the tasks are mutually exclusive, then a single function can solve all the tasks, or sorry, cannot solve all the tasks, and this could be due to label shuffling or hiding information. If they're non-mutually exclusive, this is where we run into problems, because a single function can solve all of the tasks. And in these cases, there's actually multiple solutions to the meta-learning problem. And in particular, one solution, for example, in the case of the pose prediction example, is to memorize the canonical pose of all the training objects in your meta parameters and ignore the training data. And another solution is to not carry any information about the canonical pose and infer that from the training data for each of the tasks. And in reality, there's actually an entire spectrum of solutions that kind of interpolates between these two things that can rely more or less on memorization of information versus inferring that information from the training data. And this also suggests a potential solution to the problem, which is there are these different there's essentially kind of different information that you can use to solve each of the meta-training tasks. And what you can try to do is essentially try to control the information flow. You can try to encourage it to use information from theta, or you could try to encourage it to use information from the training data. Does this make sense? Any questions? Okay, so if we want to control information flow, say we want the solution in turquoise, we want it to only acquire the information from the training data and not actually store the data in theta. Then what we could try to do is to maximize the mutual information or the kind of the information overlap between the predicted labels and the training data to encourage it to use information from the data. Unfortunately, this objective is intractable to optimize. We can't directly measure mutual information very easily. But what we're going to do instead is we can try to minimize the meta-training loss and also minimize the amount of information in theta. And what this will do is because you can either store this information in theta or extract it from the training data, then minimizing the information in theta will encourage it to use encourage it to use information from the training data and encourage it to use the training data. And this is because you're also minimizing the meta-training loss. Yeah?
And minimizing the information theta would be like a prior, you acquire something on theta? Or?
Yeah, so the way that we're going to do this is we'll first minimize the meta-training loss, and then minimizing information in theta is a difficult objective to optimize, but we'll use what's referred to as a kind of information bottleneck that tries to essentially regularize a distribution over theta to this Gaussian distribution. And so in particular, the Q of theta is representing, we're essentially going to be adding noise to theta according to the standard deviation theta sub sigma. And then we're going to encourage that distribution to look a lot like a Gaussian distribution, which is some prior distribution, P of theta. And this should ideally place precedence on using information from the training data over storing information in theta. Was there a question? Okay. In general, this sort of information bottleneck type approach is maybe not something that you've seen before. We'll actually, the tutorial tomorrow will actually cover things that are related to this particular kind of approach. But you can essentially think of it as a regularization term that adds noise to the weights and encourages that distribution to look Gaussian. Yeah?
Elaborate on what Q is.
Yeah, so Q is a Gaussian distribution with mean of theta sub mu and variance theta sub sigma. And so now we're actually storing two parameter vectors, one for the mean and one for the variance. And then when we actually use the parameters, what we're going to do is we will take the mean and add noise, basically sample from this distribution. In practice, theta sigma is going to be a diagonal covariance matrix, so we can just represent the diagonal entries as a vector. And it'll essentially correspond to adding noise proportional to theta sub sigma. Yeah?
What's P?
Yeah, so P theta, this is just a prior. It's common to use a Gaussian prior here. And because you can measure the KL divergence between Gaussians in closed form, which is pretty nice. And then you can use what's called the reparameterization trick to actually differentiate through the sampling process from a Gaussian. And this reparameterization trick will be covered on Thursday for people who aren't familiar with it. Yeah?
So I understand that we're optimizing Q to be more similar to P, but I don't understand how we use Q.
Yeah, awesome. So the way that we use Q is we sample from it, and each sample from it will be a parameter vector, and we'll use that parameter vector to parameterize the meta-learner.
Okay, so it's sort of similar to like we get a parameter vector somehow, and then we use it.
Yeah, so in this case, theta is referring to the meta parameters, and we're essentially trying to regularize the meta parameters. And so when we sample from this, the result of that sample will actually be the meta parameters rather than task-specific parameters. And you can apply this objective both to black box approaches as well as to like optimization-based approaches. Yeah.
And would we have a similar effect if we just had a dropout on theta, like a heavy dropout on the weight?
Yeah, so this is essentially like adding noise to the weights. You could also do something like dropout on weights. I haven't actually seen people do that before. People normally do dropout on activations. But I would also imagine that that would reduce information in theta.
Wouldn't it be the same? Like if you do it on activations or on the weights, because then you just don't have those activations which are contributed by the weights.
Right, so it will definitely look similar to doing it on activations. It will be a little bit different because like it's a matrix rather than a vector, and so the outcome of the matrix vector multiplication will be different. One thing that we did actually try was applying this regularizer to the activations rather than the weights, and we did actually find that it worked better on the weights because that's where it's storing the canonical information, or like the canonical pose, for example. Cool. If you don't quite understand this equation, you can essentially think of it as adding noise to theta, by essentially with the goal of trying to minimize the information in theta and encourage the model to use information from the training set for the support set. Okay, and then yeah, you can combine this with both black box approaches and optimization-based approaches. Yeah.
So here I guess you're just trying to keep the weights of theta close to what it was initially. That's what the mean divergence plot is doing?
It's actually trying to keep it close to a zero mean standard Gaussian. If you initialize with a zero mean standard Gaussian, then yes. Although you might initialize somewhere else.
But, why is that stopping it from memorizing and proposing to train deep learning? If that keeps it closer to the prior than the other way around. Maybe memorizing the post and keeps it closer to the prior than actually learning to train.
I guess one thing that is a little bit different than just trying to keep it close to the initialization is we are actually adding noise now. We're not just saying that you should stay close to the initialization. We're saying that you should, your weight should look similar to this particular distribution when you add noise. And the noisy weights are the ones that you have to use, not the mean. Yeah?
There's a question to that. What is the advantage of doing this very complex regularization versus simpler regularization like L2 on meta-parameters?
Yeah, so you can also do L2 on meta-parameters, and actually L2 is actually quite similar to this KL. It's essentially assuming that you fix the variance to 1 and you don't learn the variance of this distribution. It is pretty important to add the noise, though, to the weights, and you can essentially think of it as L2 regularization on the weights plus adding noise. Okay, cool. So as an example for how well this works, if you take Omniglot and you don't shuffle the labels such that the mapping that kind of corresponds between image classes and labels is consistent across all of the tasks, so it's non-mutually exclusive, then for MAML we see the poor performance like I mentioned before. There's another approach called task-agnostic meta-learning that tries to regularize in a way that encourages the model to predict different things, although it ends up being something that the model can kind of cheat around. Whereas this kind of meta-regularization on the weights, that's what the MR and W stand for, does a lot better at allowing the model to actually adapt from the data, allowing it to ultimately generalize to new image classes. And if you take the post-prediction task that I mentioned before, you also see a pretty significant improvement in the mean squared error but when you use the meta-regularization compared to not using meta-regularization. CNP is conditional neural processes. It corresponds to a black box approach, and you also see an improvement for the black box approaches as well. Yeah?
Could you please go back to the previous slide? So I'm curious if I can replace the trial overfitting half to be a random pair. So in that case, the positive KI divergence term will be replaced by a negative entropy term. And the motivation behind this new objective is to maximize the randomness of my parameter as much as possible, but at the same time, I wanted to make the training false.
Yeah, so the question is, can you replace this KL term with an entropy term that encourages the weights to be more and more random, essentially? I think that in principle, you should be able to do something like that. I don't think that we explicitly tried it. One challenge that can come up is that I think that maximizing entropy can be somewhat difficult.
Why would be difficult? Because you can just calculate
I guess one issue that might come up is it might maximize the entropy of some dimensions of the weights that aren't important, and not others that it's actually using in practice, and that might cause it to maximize entropy in a way that doesn't actually prevent memorization. But I'd have to. That's kind of my kind of initial reaction, and I'd have to think about it more. Yeah.
Well, I can maximize the entropy anyway because we get servers and
yeah, so this is actually already pretty close to maximum entropy because Gaussian distributions are like for a fixed variance, it's the kind of maximal entropy distribution that you can get. So it is already doing something pretty similar to maximum entropy. Yeah.
Well, what does regularization perform compared to just shuffling?
Yeah, so great question. So why not, how does this compare to just like shuffling in a way that kind of makes the tasks mutually exclusive? In general, I don't have them in this slide, but you can actually get better performance by shuffling the labels in cases where that's possible to do. In the post-prediction task, it's a little bit harder to shuffle. You can't just shuffle the labels. You actually need to shuffle the canonical orientations of different objects, essentially. And then in other cases, you just can't shuffle the labels, like in the robotics example that I mentioned before. In general, shuffling the labels is more reliable than this regularizer in settings where you can do it. Okay, and then one other thing I'll mention is if you compare this kind of regularization on the weights to things like weight decay, like was asked, and what's called Bayes by backprop, you do actually see a pretty significant difference. It's not just as simple as just running standard regularization on the model. And this weight decay example here is one where we didn't add noise. We just did weight decay on the weights. And so this is illustrating why the noise is really important. Yeah?
How does this approach compare to, for example, on the post-prediction task? If you were just to randomly add some angle to all of the labels within the task, essentially changing the canonical angle.
Yeah, so that would if you add a random angle to this task and you do that multiple times to kind of create additional copies of the task, then you are essentially making it such that the tasks are now mutually exclusive, and you wouldn't have the memorization problem again. And I think that I would guess that you would probably do a bit better than using this kind of regularization approach, because you're actually, in that case, actually forcing it to use the data. Cool. And then one other quick note that I'll mention is you can actually look at, try to theoretically derive the generalization benefits of this kind of regularizer. And if you let kind of P of theta be an arbitrary distribution, like a Gaussian distribution, then you can actually derive a generalization bound for the model. This looks pretty complicated, but essentially what it is measuring the generalization error. It's trying to upper bound that generalization error, which corresponds to error on the meta training set, and then also this meta-regularization term. And if you essentially do a Taylor expansion of the right-hand side and choose a particular value of beta on the regularization weight, then you'll actually recover the objective exactly. I don't want to go into too much of the details here, but for people who are kind of interested in some of the theoretical side of things, you might find this interesting, and you could look at the paper. Cool. And then the proof for this relies heavily on this other work that looks at kind of theoretical aspects of multitask learning. Cool. So to summarize the memorization problem, it's kind of an instance of meta-overfitting, where you are essentially memorizing the functions underlying the training tasks. And this is somewhat analogous to standard overfitting in supervised learning, where you're memorizing your training data points. So you're kind of, instead of memorizing your data points, you're memorizing your tasks. We see that one solution to this is to try to control the information flow. This is different from kind of standard regularization in supervised learning, where you're trying to regularize the hypothesis class. But the solution for controlling the information flow that we actually used is to actually regularize the description length of the meta parameters, which actually does look pretty similar to regularizing your hypothesis class. Although it is actually somewhat interesting that the kind of regularization that we use, this Gaussian prior on the weights, doesn't always actually work that well for deep neural networks. And so it's kind of interesting that you see that these pretty drastic improvements in some of the meta-learning scenarios, but I wouldn't expect to see those kinds of improvements in the standard supervised scenarios. Okay, cool. Any remaining questions? Cool. So now that we've talked about constructing tasks in a way that is ideally mutually exclusive or requiring this sort of memorization, I'd like to talk about a scenario where maybe you don't have a lot of meta-training tasks, or maybe you don't have any meta-training tasks and you only have unlabeled data. And so in particular, one of the things you might have noticed is that few-shot learning is awesome, but you do actually require tasks to be constructed from labeled data, or from demonstrations of many previous tasks, or labeled data from other regions. And so you're still require a lot of labels ultimately. And what if we only have unlabeled data? It'd be nice to be able to do few-shot meta-learning from unlabeled images or unlabeled text and so forth. Yeah.
When you say if you only have unlabeled data, does that mean, like, for example, if images you don't have the classification labeled by the image, or do you not even know like how to divide the images into tasks? Like, is it just usually is it kind of that task structure in the problem? Like, for example, even if we didn't have the land cover labels for the middle of we still know like where the images, like where which geographies they come from, and so like we can define tasks for you.
Yeah, this is a great question. There is essentially two aspects of defining tasks. One is grouping the data into these tasks, which could correspond to like geographical metadata. Another is like once you have those groupings, actually labeling those groupings and having like a labeled support set and a labeled query set. Both of those are important aspects of it. In the next couple slides, I'll talk about how we could actually like have approaches that handle the case where you don't know either of them. You just have unlabeled image data or unlabeled text data. But there are like these same sort of techniques could be used if you have the groupings but don't have the labels within those groupings. Cool. So a general recipe that we could do for this sort of thing is we have an unlabeled data set. We want to propose tasks in some way from this unlabeled data and then run meta-learning on those tasks. Now, of course, the big question is how do we propose tasks from unlabeled data? And essentially the goal of these methods is to try to automatically construct tasks from unlabeled data in a way that tries to prepare us for solving some test tasks that we want the model to be able to solve. So does anyone have thoughts on like what you might want these constructed tasks to look like? This is fairly open-ended. Yeah?
If you're starting off with just a big unlabeled data set, some sort of like clustering method where you can just kind of identify
Yeah, so if you don't know the groupings, you could try to use clustering to kind of group the data in some way. I guess we sort of saw that in the land cover classification example. Other thoughts? Is there a way that you could determine, like maybe you have a method for proposing tasks? How would you understand if that's like a good method or not? Yeah?
If you have some way to propose tasks, you could try to start using meta-learning algorithms on these tasks and then see if they then work to newly sample tasks using the same way that you could sample the original training tasks.
Yeah, cool. So you could sample a bunch of tasks and see if you run meta-learning on those tasks, can it then learn new tasks from that same sampling scheme? And what would that tell you if it can't?
It would tell you that the sampling scheme isn't very good, or doesn't create tasks that are different upon the data.
Yeah. So if it doesn't generalize to the task that you sample, then that means that you're creating tasks in a way that doesn't for which the support set doesn't tell you much about how to solve the query set. Cool. So essentially the kind of two things that I had in mind is, first, we want the sample tasks to be diverse, because ultimately if you have some test tasks that you want to be able to solve with a small amount of labels, then if you have a diverse set of tasks, then it's more likely to cover those tasks. And then the second thing that you want is you want them to be structured. And in particular, if they don't have any shared structure to them, then you may not actually be able to kind of get any information from the support set. And then it wouldn't be able to perform few-shot learning. We'd see the same issue that was brought up. Cool. So we want both of these, because if we have completely random tasks that are super diverse, but they're not structured enough, and likewise, the opposite would be bad as well. So next we'll look at a method for constructing tasks from unlabeled image data, and also task construction from unlabeled text data. Cool. So the first approach that we'll look at is actually heavily based on clustering, which is suggested. So we'll get some unsupervised embedding space. And this will essentially allow us to map from images into some lower dimensional embedding space. Then we can cluster the images within this embedding space to get different to get different tasks that correspond to discriminating different clusters. And so, for example, we can sample some tasks or cluster these images into in the embedding space to get different clusters, and then different tasks will correspond to discriminating these different clusters. And so, for example, what we could do is when we want to sample a new task, we'll sample two clusters. These two clusters will correspond to two classes or different classes within that classification task. The number of clusters you sample will correspond to the number of classes. And then we could sample new images within those clusters to get a query set. And then we could do this likewise for the purple cluster and the green cluster to get another task. And this would give us a two-way one-shot classification task. Yeah?
In this unsupervised setting, I guess in general, if you just have a data set of unlabeled images and no tasks structure at all, even if we have a method like this, cluster images based on test similarities, aren't we in some sense just limited in how much we can express what a task is? Because initially we had defined a task to also not only contain its own data set, but also potentially a loss function. And I don't see an obvious way to kind of cluster this and define there's a regression task here or a classification task here. How do that when everything's unsupervised?
Yeah, so this is going to be specific to classification tasks. It won't necessarily be specific to certain data sets, but it will be a way to get different classification tasks. I haven't thought too much about how you would get regression tasks, at least in this circumstance. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly how you would get regression tasks. Yeah.
Is the number of clusters just a hyperparameter that we can vary? Because presumably, the more classes you have, the harder the problem becomes, right?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you determine the number of clusters? And generally, if you if you know anything about your meta test task, like maybe you know that you have like a few examples of a binary classification task, then what you could do is you can make a bunch of binary classification tasks. If you don't know exactly what it's going to be, then what you can do is just set it to be sufficiently large such that you're training it on classification tasks that are like up to like 50 way, for example, and then your meta learner should be able to generalize to tasks that are up to 50 way, for example. Yeah.
So doesn't this shift the problem from learning the meta learner to clustering, because it seems like the upper bound is just like the supervised meta learning case, where you do have exactly what the task distribution or what the different tasks are, but in the clustering case, like you could cluster it directly and then mess up your task distribution.
Yeah, so I guess the question is this kind of shifting the responsibility from the kind of meta learning process to the task construction process? And it certainly is shifting responsibility. And the design of these tasks, like you do want it to kind of reflect the kinds of tasks, like ultimately you want to reflect the kinds of tasks that you'll see at meta test time, and you want there to be kind of as close of overlap as you can get. And so in many ways, these kinds of approaches may end up being somewhat domain specific, and in the sense that you want to construct tasks in an unsupervised way that do cover the tasks in that domain that you care about. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Isn't the performance of this method slightly better when the unsupervised method gets ready? So the multiple data sets that my presentation?
Yeah, so the question is, like, doesn't this depend on how good your initial embedding space is? And it certainly does. What we're actually going to use in this case is there's an approach called deep cluster that actually kind of integrates representation learning and clustering so that you're actually using the clustering to get the representation. But if you have a better representation learning method, then you could also use that. And really the natural baseline here will be to compare the result of meta learning on these tasks to doing some sort of thing like linear classifier on top of that embedding space. And your goal is to be able to do better than just like a linear classifier on that embedding space. Cool. So here's one example of how you can construct tasks with this sort of clustering approach. And we wanted to get essentially a representation that's particularly suitable for few-shot learning of downstream tasks compared to this original representation space. In terms of some of the details, you can use it like, I guess this paper was from a couple years ago, and so these are a little bit outdated at this point, but you can use representation learning methods like this ByGAN or something like deep cluster, which does integrate clustering and representation learning. Method is referred to as clustering to automatically construct tasks for unsupervised meta learning, or CACTUS. It's a bit of a forced acronym. And then we used MAML and prototypical networks. And if you're curious what a forced acronym with MAML looks like, or a CACTUS MAML, you get something like this. And if you look at performance on mini-ImageNet, 5-way, 5-shot classification, first, like kind of our Oracle method is to use MAML with all of the labels on the data. Then we could take the representation from ByGAN and do k-nearest neighbors on that representation. We get around a 31% success rate on these 5-shot tasks. We could also do logistic regression on top of that representation. We do a little bit better. If you want, we tried regularizing it and doing an MLP. That actually did worse than just logistic regression. We also tried some sort of cluster matching. And then when we actually ran meta learning on top of the tasks that were derived from this representation, we see a performance of 51%, which is kind of substantially better than 33%, because you're essentially preparing the representation for the ability to do few-shot learning. And then also, if you use the deep cluster representation, this kind of shows you the kind of dependence of this method on the representation. It does actually do better with a deep cluster representation than the ByGAN representation. So these are the results for kind of one few-shot classification task. I won't show all the others, but it's really the same kind of trend and story for different embedding methods for different data sets. And these different data sets also includes things like attribute prediction in SLEB. Prototypical networks underperforms in some cases, but we generally saw the same story with both mammal and prototypical networks. And then we also see that this works well if you have larger data sets. I think that we looked at like data sets of up to 100 shot or something like that. Yeah.
So this does require somewhat like a domain knowledge. You need to know if you're going to be doing it test time against animals as class classification or like dogs as cats. So you can decide to increase your clusters, number of clusters for like dogs as cats and keep a smaller one.
Yeah, so there is kind of some domain knowledge that's kind of inherently a part of the method based on the number of like clusters that you choose and ultimately like what representation you use and so forth. And actually, what I was going to talk about next is can we actually even use even more domain knowledge when constructing these tasks? And for example, like there are scenarios in image classification where we know that there are certain data augmentations that will still preserve the label, and we can use this domain knowledge to actually construct even better tasks. So for example, we know that things like dropping out some pixels or translating the image or reflecting the image, those sorts of things generally don't change the image class. And if you know that you're going to be doing image classification problems, you could try to integrate this domain knowledge into the tasks. And so you can get transformations that look something like this or something like this. And then when you do task construction, instead of doing the clustering approach that I mentioned before, you can randomly sample n images and assign them labels 1 through n. So for example, you could sample these 3 images, assign them labels 1, 2, 3. This will be your support set, and then for each data point in this support set, you can augment the example using your domain knowledge to construct other examples of the same image class, and this can be your query set. So this is stored in dtrain, this is stored in dtest. And this is essentially another way to construct tasks, except with completely unlabeled data, except now we're going to be using domain knowledge to potentially construct better tasks because we can essentially get lots of data of like support query sets with these different transformations. Cool. How do you actually go about augmenting in practice? For Omniglot, they used translation and random pixel dropout. And for Mini ImageNet, they used what's referred to as auto-augment, which does a combination of translation, rotation, and shearing. And the result is that this sort of approach did really super well on Omniglot. It's able to bridge a lot of the gap between unsupervised methods and fully supervised methods. And in, for example, the 5-way 5-shot case, it's getting 95% accuracy, despite only having 5 examples per class. And this is where we have like pretty good domain knowledge because the images are relatively simple. And then on Mini ImageNet, we see that it kind of slightly underperforms the clustering-based approach, probably just because clustering is a pretty good domain knowledge in terms of trying to do some sort of image classification. Okay, so that's the image case. What about if we have unlabeled text? One option is to just formulate it as a language modeling problem. We've seen this with things like GPT-3, T5, and so forth, where essentially dtrain is kind of a sequence of characters. Dtest is the following sequence of characters, and you can construct tasks by trying to predict what will come next and formulating the training data as text. And so we saw this where you could kind of construct tasks like math problems as text and spelling correction problems as text and so forth. We might not use this option in all cases. So this approach is harder to combine with these optimization-based approaches because you don't have like a clear like input and labels, for example. It's also hard to apply this to classification tasks. You could formulate a classification task as a prediction task where you need to predict a token of like 0 or 1, for example. But if you actually tell the model that the output is only going to be 0 or 1 and it has to pick between them, then kind of formulating it as a classification problem is easier than formulating it as a language generation problem. And so another option that has been explored is to try to construct tasks by masking out words. And then the task is to classify the masked word. And so what this looks like is you sample a subset of unique words, assign them an ID. So for example, you might pick the words democratic and capital and assign them the ID of 1 and 2. Then sample a bunch of sentences with those words and mask the word out. And then construct a support set and a query set with the masked sentences, and then the corresponding word IDs are the labels. And so as an example of what a training data set would look like is you would give it a sentence like this. This has a class label of 1 because the masked word here is democratic. This would also have a masked label of 1. This one would have a label of 2, and this one would have a label of 2. And so this is your support set with kind of inputs X and labels Y. And then in terms of your test set, then you get a new query with a kind of also with a masked out word, and then you need to predict 1 or 2. So you can do this with just completely unlabeled text and get a bunch of classification problems out. Any questions on how this works? Yeah.
How much data do you need to do like that test set?
So how much support data or how much meta-training data?
How much meta-training data?
So good question. So the question is, how much meta-training data do you need to do this well? I guess it probably depends on how complex your text is. So if you have very broad text, you need to understand the kind of context and so forth as well. It's also going to depend on what you choose for like N-way and K-shot as well. So if you see a lot of examples per class, that makes it easier. If you have a lot of classes, then you actually need to understand language a lot more to understand what should go in that blank, rather than like you might be able to do some simple pattern matching if you have just 2 classes. So it's probably going to depend a lot on the details of the data set. Cool. So here are a bunch of numbers. The results on the left are methods that do this entirely unsupervised pre-training approach, whereas the methods on the right are doing some sort of supervised or semi-supervised pre-training. And so in particular, the approach that we mentioned before is in this second column, and this is in comparison to BERT. And then everything on the right is actually combining the generated tasks with supervised tasks. And you're sort of doing like semi-supervised meta-learning where you have some supervised tasks and some unsupervised tasks. And then there's likewise other kind of semi-supervised approaches that are also being compared to. And in particular, BERT is a standard self-supervised learning method. The second column is the kind of proposed unsupervised meta-learning approach. MT-BERT is doing multitask learning and fine-tuning on supervised tasks. Leopard is an optimization-based meta-learner that's only doing it on the supervised tasks again. And then this hybrid method is doing meta-learning on the proposed tasks as well as on the supervised tasks. And so the comparison between Leopard and SMLMT is showing you how much those unsupervised tasks are helping in comparison to only using the supervised tasks. Cool, and then in terms of the results, we see that first, in terms of the last 2 columns, we see that there is a pretty substantial or significant improvement between using the unsupervised tasks in addition to only using the supervised tasks. And then we also see improvements over BERT with fine-tuning. Yeah?
Why is the unsupervised SMLMT doing better on the disaster data set than the semi-supervised version of the same method?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why that's the case. They probably have more details in the paper about it. I can't remember exactly what that what that data set corresponds to. It could be that maybe when they set the ratio of the supervised tasks and the unsupervised tasks, maybe they set the ratio of supervised tasks too high, and maybe they're overfitting to those supervised tasks. But yeah, I'd have to take a look at the paper for more, and there is more results and analysis in the paper as well. Cool. So that's an overview of unsupervised meta-learning and how we can try to construct tasks from unlabeled image data and unlabeled text data as well. And we can also combine those unlabeled tasks with supervised tasks as well as a form of task augmentation. We have a bit more time, so I'll also briefly talk about one other unsupervised meta-learning scenario, which is what if we have time series? And the time series is actually labeled. So for example, maybe we want to predict energy demand, or we want to predict the dynamics of a robot or a car, or transportation usage, or we want to make some money and we want to predict the stock market, video analytics, or reinforcement learning agent. Oftentimes we do actually have lots of streams of data, but they're fully unsegmented in the sense that they aren't like really broken into tasks. And so we actually have, this is actually a scenario where we have the labeled data, but we don't have the groupings into tasks. And so we want to be able to somehow get the groupings of tasks and do meta-learning in a way that allows us to very quickly predict for a new time series with a small amount of data. Cool, so it's unsegmented. We do have temporal structure. Like in many cases, there are kind of discrete points in time where something changes. Like maybe like Facebook stock may have had a discrete change earlier this week. So can we segment the time series into tasks and then meta-learn across those tasks? Another question becomes how to segment. There's a class of approaches called change point detection methods that try to essentially detect where those discrete changes happen. And in particular, we kind of assume that the tasks will switch with some probability at every single time step. And so you could kind of view it according to this visual where each of the dashed lines are essentially like a change point in the task. And the function is essentially kind of like piecewise linear. And then once we make this assumption, then we should maintain a belief over the task duration or the run length, and estimate some distribution over what we think the duration is. And so in particular, for this example, we would kind of the run length or the task duration for each of these tasks is increasing by 1 at each time step until you hit that change point, and then it goes back to 0 and then increases again. So in this work, they showed that you can actually update the belief recursively based off of models, the model performance, and essentially figure out, essentially update your belief over what the task duration is and figure out whether or not there is a change point at the current time step or not. Now, one of the cool things about this approach is that this, because it's actually representing these probabilities over over the run length, this procedure is actually fully differentiable. And so what you can do is you can actually backpropagate through the update, the belief update, into a model that's being meta-trained to perform few-shot classification on this time series. And so kind of the result is you can do, in some meta-training phase, you're given some unsegmented time series of offline data. And then at test time, you're given kind of streaming online data. And what you'll do is you will essentially do meta-learning and do kind of joint change point prediction and few-shot meta-learning over these segments in your time series. And then at meta-test time, you'll use your few-shot learner to predict forward and also use what you learned before to also predict where the change points are. And so you can do something like sinusoid regression, where you have discrete shifts in the actual sinusoid function. And you get a cool visualization like this, where the red is predicting the ground truth sinusoid function at the given point in time. And then the blue is showing the model's predictions for that sinusoid. And you can see that very quickly when it gets a new sinusoid, it realizes that the task has changed, and then it's able to very quickly identify what the correct curve is. And then at the same time, the algorithm is also maintaining its kind of current belief over the run length and whether or not the task has actually changed. Cool. And then you can also make a streaming version of mini ImageNet and also get kind of allow it to identify when the task has changed. So the blue curve is showing kind of the test accuracy in the streaming setting, whereas the gray top curve is showing some oracle. So you do get a performance hit because the task is actually changing at test time. But you are actually able to do still fairly well in this setting. And then the window-based approaches are just treating different tasks as different windows in time. Yeah. Cool, yeah, so the x-axis is the rate at which the change points are coming. And so further to the right means that you have change points more frequently, and it gets harder, understandably. And then to the left means that the change points are happening less frequently. So the task is changing less frequently. Yes, average over all time. Yeah. Cool. So that's it for today. To recap, we talked about task construction. We talked about how memorization issues can come up if you construct your tasks or if you're in scenarios where your tasks are not mutually exclusive. And we talked about one solution that seems to work well for classification tasks at least, but I don't think it's necessarily the final solution. We also talked about how we can potentially try to construct tasks in an unsupervised fashion, either from unlabeled text data and unlabeled image data, or from time series that isn't segmented. Cool. And then next time, on Monday next week, we're going to have our last meta-learning, supervised meta-learning lecture, where we'll talk about Bayesian meta-learning and how you can cast meta-learning into the framework of Bayesian graphical models. If you're not familiar with tools from variational inference, I'd encourage you to go to the tutorial at 4 p.m. tomorrow. And then I'll see everyone next week.